This story is titled, My Stepmom Made Me Work 2 Jobs While Paying for My Stepsister's Study Abroad Expenses. In her room, I discovered documents from my father addressed to me. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. Hey Reddit, this has been on my mind for a long time, and I feel like I need to get it all out. To give you some backstory, my dad, Michael, was my whole world. He wasn't just a father. He was everything. My guide, my protector, and the person who made life feel stable. My mom passed away when I was 6, so it was just the two of us from then on. We didn't have much, but he made sure I never felt like I was missing out on anything important. Dad ran a small auto repair shop in Denver. It was nothing fancy, but he was good at what he did, and he loved it. I spent a lot of time there after school, sitting in a corner with my homework or handing him tools when he needed an extra set of hands. That shop was where I learned how to change oil, fix a flat, and even replace a car battery. He used to joke that if I ever decided to ditch college, I'd always have a backup plan. We weren't rich by any stretch, but Dad made it work. He made sure I had everything I needed. School supplies, clothes, even little treats here and there, like stopping for ice cream after a long day. But what I loved most was how present he always was. He'd show up to my school plays in his grease-stained uniform, clap the loudest at my recitals, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. If I had a problem, I knew I could talk to him about it, and he'd actually listen. When I turned 17, everything started to change. Dad told me he'd met someone, this woman named Irene. He talked about her like she was the answer to all his prayers. "She's so kind, Emily," he'd say, "and she understands what it's like to lose someone." Irene was a nurse, so I guess that part made sense. She had this calm, professional vibe, and she came across as super caring. At first, I was happy for him. He deserved someone who could take care of him after everything he'd done for me. Irene had a daughter, Clara, who was a year younger than me. She was bubbly and charismatic, the kind of girl who could charm her way out of anything. When Dad introduced us, she was all smiles, talking about her dreams of traveling and studying abroad. I thought, wow, maybe this won't be so bad. A stepsister could be fun. Irene and Clara moved in with us after the wedding, and everything about our home shifted. Dad tried hard to make it work. He wanted us to be a real family. But it was obvious from the start that Irene had different priorities. She doted on Clara, treating her like a princess. Anything Clara wanted, she got, no questions asked. New clothes, extracurricular activities, expensive hobbies. It was all about Clara. Meanwhile, if I needed something, it was suddenly a tight budget month. Irene didn't outright ignore me, but her favoritism was painfully obvious. She'd always have some excuse, like Clara has so much potential, or she's working so hard on her future. If I asked for the same things, I'd get lectures about responsibility or guilt trips about how much Dad was already doing for me. It wasn't fair, but I didn't want to make things harder for him, so I just let it slide. Dad noticed, though. He'd take me out for breakfast sometimes, just the two of us, or surprise me with something small like a book I'd been eyeing. He tried to make sure I didn't feel left out, but I could tell he was stretched thin. I overheard them arguing once, and my name came up. Irene was upset about how much time and attention Dad was giving me, and Dad was trying to explain that I was his daughter, his responsibility. They fought more often after that. The worst part was watching Dad change. He started to seem tired, not just physically, but emotionally. He was still my dad, still trying to make everything okay, but there was this weight on him that hadn't been there before. I don't think he ever regretted marrying Irene, but I do think he underestimated how much she'd expect from him, and from me. About a year into their marriage, Dad and I had one of our rare one-on-one breakfasts. He seemed quieter than usual, more reflective. Then he said something that stuck with me. "Emily, I just want you to know I'm always on your side. If things ever get too hard, you come to me, okay?" I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, and we went back to eating our pancakes. Looking back, I think he knew things weren't going to last with Irene. Maybe he was even considering leaving, but he didn't want to tell me until he had a plan. Before he could make any changes, everything fell apart. It was a rainy afternoon, and Dad was driving back from picking up parts for the shop. He didn't make it home. I'll never forget that phone call. The police said it was an accident, that the rain made the roads slick. None of it mattered. He was gone. The funeral was a blur. Irene took charge of everything, deciding who would speak and what songs would play. She cried a lot, and Clara clung to her the whole time. People kept telling me how strong I was, how proud my dad would be of me, but I felt like I was breaking apart. The one person who had always been there for me was gone, and I didn't know how I was supposed to move forward. After Dad passed, life became a game of survival, and Irene was the referee, setting rules that only benefited her and Clara. I was 19 and barely out of high school when the weight of the household fell on me. Irene wasted no time making it clear that things had changed. "We all have to pull our weight now," she'd say. But her idea of pulling weight was me footing the bills while Clara lived her best life. At first, I thought it was temporary. I was grieving, and part of me felt obligated to step up. It was my way of honoring Dad, I guess. But it didn't take long to realize that Irene wasn't asking for help. She was demanding it. Rent, utilities, groceries, it all landed on my shoulders. If I even hinted at the unfairness of it, she'd hit me with, "This is what families do for each other, Emily." Meanwhile, Clara was packing for Paris. That's right. While I was working 2 jobs to make sure the lights stayed on, Clara was off to study art abroad. Irene called it a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and gushed about how talented Clara was. "She has such potential," she'd say, as if that justified everything. The word sacrifices came up a lot in those conversations. According to Irene, we were all making sacrifices to support Clara's dreams. But let's be real, I was the one making sacrifices. My days started early, stocking shelves at the grocery store. It was mindless work, but exhausting in its own way. Customers would complain about things being out of stock or ask for help finding random items, and I'd just plaster on a smile and keep moving. By the time my shift ended, my feet were already aching, but there was no time to rest. I'd grab a quick bite, usually something cheap and sad, like a gas station sandwich, before heading to my second job at the diner. The diner was a whole different kind of chaos. Between rude customers, finicky orders, and the constant hum of the kitchen, I barely had time to breathe. There were nights I'd get home so late that I didn't even bother changing out of my uniform before collapsing into bed. And somehow, I still never had enough money. Irene's demands kept growing, and my paychecks vanished as soon as they hit my account. It wasn't just about money, though. Irene treated me like an unpaid housekeeper on top of everything else. Clara's room, always spotless thanks to me. Laundry, guess who folded it? Dishes? Yep, my job too. Irene would sit at the kitchen table with her tea, watching me scrub the counters, and if I didn't do it to her standards, she'd sigh dramatically and fix it herself. "You need to take more pride in your work," she'd say, like I wasn't already running myself into the ground. I kept telling myself it would get better. Maybe once Clara finished her program in Paris, things would ease up. Maybe Irene would recognize how much I was contributing and cut me some slack. But deep down, I knew better. Clara was Irene's golden child, the one with all the potential, while I was just the help. What made it worse was how casually they dismissed my struggles. One time, I mentioned how hard it was juggling work and school. Clara, who was home for a short visit before heading back to Paris, laughed and said, "Well, you're not really the academic type, are you?" Irene chimed in, "Some people are meant to be dreamers, and others are meant to be doers. You're a doer, Emily." It was like they were telling me I should be grateful for the scraps they threw my way. The thing is, I wasn't some slacker with no ambition. I was going to community college, squeezing in classes whenever I could between shifts. I didn't have big dreams like Clara's, but I wanted more for myself. I wanted to build a life where I didn't feel like a prisoner in my own home. But every time I started to get ahead, Irene found a way to pull me back down. Take the time I saved up $500. I'd been working double shifts at the diner, skipping lunch, and walking to work to save on gas. I was so proud of myself. I finally had a little cushion, something to fall back on. Then, out of nowhere, Irene hit me with, "The water heater broke, and we need to replace it. You'll need to chip in." There went my $500. No discussion, no consideration for what I might need. It was like I didn't even exist outside of what I could provide for them. Clara, of course, was living in a completely different world. Her Instagram was full of pictures of her sipping coffee at Parisian cafes, visiting museums, and posing in front of landmarks. Irene would show me the posts and gush, "Isn't she amazing? She's making the most of her time there." Meanwhile, I was eating ramen noodles for dinner and praying my car wouldn't break down. The worst part was the loneliness. I didn't have time for friends or hobbies, and I certainly didn't have anyone to lean on. Irene and Clara made it clear that I wasn't part of their little club. They had their inside jokes and shared dreams, and I was just there. I missed Dad so much during those years. He would have been furious if he'd seen how they treated me, but he wasn't there. and I didn't know how to stand up for myself. There were moments when I thought about leaving, just packing a bag and starting over somewhere far away. But then I'd think about Dad and feel this overwhelming guilt. He'd always taught me to do the right thing, to take care of family, and I didn't want to let him down. So, I stayed. I worked. I paid the bills. And I tried not to think about how unfair it all was. Looking back now, I don't know how I survived those years. I was constantly exhausted, physically and emotionally. But at the time, I didn't feel like I had a choice. Irene controlled everything. My finances, my time, my sense of self-worth. It was like I was trapped in this endless cycle of work and obligation, with no way out. The thing is, I thought I could handle it. I thought if I just kept my head down and worked hard enough, I'd eventually earn their respect, or at least some peace. But Irene and Clara didn't see me as a person. To them, I was a resource, something to be used and discarded when it was no longer convenient. And it would take me years to realize just how much they had taken from me. But then, all I could do was survive. Oh, I forgot to tell you that shortly after Dad and Irene's marriage, she convinced him to pass down the title deed of the house, our house, to her, claiming that this would cherish the trust and bonding among us, and it would make us more of a successful blended family. So, now Irene decided it was time to downsize. Or more accurately, she decided I should help her downsize. Clara was back in Paris, and Irene, of course, was managing things from her spot on the couch with a mug of tea and her phone. "Emily, you'll need to start with your room," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We're trying to clear out the clutter, not hold on to unnecessary things." My childhood bedroom hadn't been mine for a long time. Irene and Clara had taken over most of the space after Dad passed. The shelves, once filled with my favorite books, now held Clara's trophies and framed pictures from her study abroad adventures. The closet, crammed with boxes that weren't even mine. But sure, I'd clean it out for the big move. I spent hours sorting through old boxes, tossing anything that looked like junk and setting aside the few items that still felt like mine. It was mindless work, but also strangely emotional. Every so often, I'd find something that brought back memories of Dad. A ticket stub from a movie he took me to, a doodle he made on a piece of scrap paper. As I reached the back of the closet, I noticed something strange. One of the baseboards was slightly loose, sticking out just enough to catch my eye. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check it out. I tugged at the edge, and the board popped free, revealing a small envelope tucked behind it. My name was scrawled across the front in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. Dad's. My heart stopped. It felt like I'd stumbled into some kind of time capsule, a message sent from a different life. I opened the envelope carefully, afraid of damaging whatever was inside. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, and folded neatly. As I unfolded it, my eyes went straight to the date at the top. It was written just 2 weeks before Dad died. The first line made my chest tighten. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means something went wrong." I sat down on the floor, right there in the middle of the mess I'd been sorting through, and kept reading. "I set aside a college fund for you. $40,000. Irene knows about it. That money is yours and yours alone. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to follow your dreams, no matter what. Don't let anyone take that from you." I read the letter over and over, my hands shaking more each time. My dad, in his usual careful and thoughtful way, had planned for my future. He wanted me to have the chance to build something for myself. And Irene, she knew. She knew all along and kept it from me. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just discovered. All those nights I worked until my legs felt like they'd give out. All those times I scraped together enough money to help with bills while Clara was off sipping lattes in Paris. It was all funded by my money. The sacrifices Irene had talked about, they weren't sacrifices. They were theft. I felt sick. Every memory of Irene praising Clara's potential or brushing off my struggles came flooding back with a new, bitter clarity. She'd stolen from me. Stolen my dad's last gift to me. Stolen my chance at a future that didn't involve working myself to exhaustion just to survive. And she'd done it without a shred of guilt. The sound of Irene's voice snapped me back to reality. "Emily, what's taking so long?" she called from downstairs. Her tone was light, almost cheerful, as if she hadn't spent the last few years dismantling my life piece by piece. I stuffed the letter back into the envelope and shoved it into my pocket. My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't let her see me like this. Not yet. "Just finishing up," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. I spent the rest of the afternoon mechanically packing up the remaining boxes, barely registering what I was doing. My mind was racing. What was I supposed to do now? March downstairs and confront Irene? Demand an explanation? Part of me wanted to, but another part, the part that had been beaten down by years of her manipulation, told me to wait. By the time I carried the last box down to the living room, I'd made a decision. I needed time to figure out my next move, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let Irene get away with this. As I walked into the living room, Irene glanced up from her phone with a satisfied smile. "That didn't take too long," she said, as if I hadn't spent the entire day cleaning up her mess. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. "I just need some air," I replied without looking back. Outside, the crisp evening air hit me like a wake-up call. I pulled the letter out of my pocket and read it again under the dim glow of the streetlights. Dad's words felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't imagining the unfairness of it all. He had believed in me, even if Irene didn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but by the time I went back inside, I had a plan. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Confronting Irene was not part of my original plan. I wanted to take my time, gather my thoughts, and maybe even figure out a way to regain what she had stolen from me without turning it into a full-blown battle. But the more I thought about that letter and the years of sacrifices I'd been forced to make, the angrier I got. And then Clara came home. Clara's arrival was always a production. She floated into the house with an air of superiority, her arms laden with designer luggage, and her face glowing with the tan she'd picked up in some European city. Irene practically bent over backward to make her visit perfect. She spent the entire day fussing over Clara, cooking her favorite meals, and catching up on every detail of her glamorous life abroad. Meanwhile, I was barely acknowledged. When Clara asked how I'd been, it was almost laughable. She didn't care about my answer. She just wanted to check the box of pretending to be polite. Her casual dismissal of me made my blood boil. That was when I decided I couldn't wait any longer. The idea hit me during dinner. It was a rare moment when the three of us were sitting at the table together, and the dynamic was as predictable as ever. Irene and Clara dominated the conversation, chatting about Paris and Clara's upcoming plans, as if I weren't even there. I kept my head down, pushing my food around on my plate, until Clara made a comment that finally pushed me over the edge. "Mom, I was thinking," Clara began, her voice dripping with entitlement. "Maybe next year we could look into a better apartment. The one I have now is fine, but I feel like I could really thrive in a nicer place. Something closer to campus." Irene nodded enthusiastically, already brainstorming ways to make it happen. I sat there in stunned silence. Was she serious? She was already living the dream, and now she wanted more? That was it. I couldn't stay silent anymore. "I found something interesting the other day," I said, cutting into their conversation. My voice was steady, but I could feel my hands trembling under the table. Both of them turned to look at me, startled by my sudden interjection. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the letter. "What's that?" Irene asked, her tone carefully neutral, but I saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. "It's a letter from Dad," I said, placing it on the table. "Written 2 weeks before he died." Irene froze, her smile slipping. Clara, mid-bite, paused, her fork hovering in midair. The silence was deafening as I pushed the letter toward Irene. "Go ahead," I said, my voice sharper now. "Read it." Irene picked up the letter with shaking hands. Her face paled as she scanned the words. Clara, meanwhile, was trying to act like she didn't care, but I caught her glancing at the letter out of the corner of her eye. "This isn't what you think," Irene stammered finally, placing the letter back on the table as if it had burned her fingers. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "Oh, it's exactly what I think," I shot back, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You stole my future to fund hers." Clara let out a small laugh, the kind of dismissive sound she always made when she thought she was above whatever was happening. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're acting like you're the victim here." "Because I am the victim," I snapped, turning to face her. "You've been living off money that was meant for me, money Dad set aside so I could have a future. Meanwhile, I've been working 2 jobs just to keep the lights on in this house." Clara's smirk wavered, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, come on, Emily. Do you really think Dad would have wanted you to throw away that money on some dead-end dream? He probably realized it was better spent on someone with actual potential." Her words hit me like a slap in the face, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. I turned back to Irene, who was still sitting there in stunned silence. "Did you ever plan on telling me?" I demanded. "Or were you just going to let me keep breaking my back while you handed everything to her?" Irene finally found her voice. "Emily, you have to understand," she began, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "It wasn't like that. I was going to—" "Save it," I interrupted. "I don't want your excuses. I want answers. Where's the rest of the money?" Irene looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. "There's nothing left," she admitted quietly. "It all went toward Clara's tuition and living expenses." "Unbelievable," I muttered, leaning back in my chair. The anger I'd been holding onto for years was boiling over, and I couldn't stop it anymore. "You had no right. That money wasn't yours to give. It was mine." "Emily," Irene tried again, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "We're a family. I did what I thought was best for all of us." "No," I said firmly. "You did what was best for you and Clara. Don't pretend for a second that you care about me." Clara finally spoke up again, her voice cold and cutting. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. It's not like you were going to do anything with that money anyway." That was the final straw. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't get to decide that," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "Dad believed in me, even if you two didn't. And now, you'll pay for this. Legally." I grabbed the letter and stormed out of the room, leaving Irene and Clara sitting there in stunned silence. My hands were still trembling as I walked to my room and shut the door behind me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had stolen from me, but I was going to make sure they paid for it. That night, I remembered my dad's brother, Uncle David. He's a lawyer, sharp as a tack, and not the kind of guy you'd want to cross. Growing up, I didn't see him much. He lived in a different state and was always busy. But whenever he visited, he and Dad would sit at the kitchen table for hours, talking about everything from cars to family to life. Dad trusted him completely, and if anyone could help me now, it was him. The next morning, I called David. I didn't give him every detail over the phone, but I explained enough for him to understand what was going on. He didn't sound surprised, just pissed. "Come see me," he said. "I think we need to talk about what Michael left behind." I made the drive to David's office the next day. Walking into that space was intimidating. He worked in a sleek, modern firm that screamed, "I win cases." But when he saw me, his face softened. He hugged me and said, "You look just like your dad." That simple comment almost broke me, but I held it together. We sat in his office and I laid everything out. The letter, Irene's confession, the years I spent supporting a household that didn't support me back. David listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he nodded and opened a file drawer behind his desk. "Your dad saw this coming," he said, pulling out a thick folder. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. David slid the folder across the desk toward me. Michael wasn't stupid. He knew Irene had, let's say, questionable priorities. He was worried about what might happen if he wasn't around to protect you, so he gave me copies of everything. Bank statements, signed letters, even recordings of conversations with Irene about your college fund. I opened the folder, my hands trembling. Inside were pages and pages of evidence. The bank statements alone were shocking. Regular deposits Dad had made into a savings account labeled Emily's Future Fund. There were also records showing that 3 months after Dad died, Irene drained the account and moved the money into her own name. But that wasn't all. David had documentation of other assets Dad had left for me. Investments in stocks, a small property he'd purchased as a rental, even a life insurance policy. Altogether, it was worth far more than the $40,000 college fund I'd known about. Irene hadn't just taken one piece of my inheritance, she'd taken everything. I stared at the papers, overwhelmed. How did she get away with this?" I asked, my voice shaking. David leaned back in his chair, his expression hard. "Because she thought she could. But she's not getting away with it anymore. We're going to file a lawsuit for embezzlement and financial misconduct. And with all this evidence, she doesn't stand a chance." And hearing those words felt like a lifeline. For the first time in years, I felt like I had someone on my side, someone who could actually do something about the injustice I'd endured. David didn't waste any time. Within days, he'd filed the lawsuit. Irene was served with legal papers, and her reaction was exactly what I expected. Denial, outrage, and attempts to guilt-trip me. She called and left me long, rambling voicemails about how I was tearing the family apart and ruining Clara's future. I ignored every single one. Clara, meanwhile, went radio silent. I'm guessing she was too busy freaking out about what this lawsuit would mean for her cushy lifestyle. She'd always acted like nothing could touch her, but now she was realizing just how fragile her world was. The lawsuit moved quickly, thanks to David's airtight case. The evidence was undeniable. When we presented everything in court, Irene didn't even bother trying to argue. She just sat there, pale and silent, while the judge read the verdict. When the court ruling finally came through, it was like this massive weight had been lifted off my chest. I had been bracing for some kind of loophole, some way for Irene to squirm out of the consequences. But there it was in black and white. She had to repay every penny she'd taken, plus interest, and face criminal charges for what she'd done. Justice wasn't just served, it came with a full-course meal. Irene looked like a ghost the last day in court. She didn't even try to argue anymore. Her lawyer's efforts to paint her as a misguided mother trying to do her best for the family fell flat. The evidence David had brought in was airtight. The judge didn't mince words either, laying out how calculated and deliberate her actions had been. There wasn't a shred of sympathy left in the courtroom for her. Irene's nursing license was revoked almost immediately. Losing her job hit her hard, and from what I heard, no one in the community was willing to give her another chance. People whispered about her everywhere she went. It didn't take long for her to stop showing her face around town. She became a social pariah overnight. And Clara? Well, let's just say her golden girl status didn't hold up without Irene funding her lifestyle. She was forced to drop out of her Paris program. The thought of her packing up her designer clothes and leaving behind her picture-perfect life felt surreal. Clara was the kind of person who acted like nothing could touch her. And now here she was, stuck in the same small town she'd looked down on for years. She ended up taking a job at a department store in the mall. I couldn't help but laugh a little when I walked past one day and saw her folding sweaters under fluorescent lights. It was such a stark contrast to the polished, jet-setting image she'd cultivated online. To be honest, I didn't feel sorry for her. Clara had spent years benefiting from Irene's schemes, and while she hadn't orchestrated it herself, she hadn't exactly complained about the perks either. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't have to work ridiculous hours to keep up with Irene's demands, or watch Clara flaunt a life that was paid for with what should have been mine. That weight, the constant pressure, the never-ending guilt trips, it was finally gone. It felt strange at first, like I didn't know what to do with myself. I had spent so long just trying to survive that I had forgotten what it was like to actually live. When the dust finally settled, I moved into a tiny studio apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single room with a small kitchenette and a window that overlooked a noisy street. But to me, it was paradise. It was the first place I'd ever lived where I didn't feel like I was an unwelcome guest. I used some of the inheritance money to furnish the apartment. I went to thrift stores, scoured online marketplaces, and slowly turned the bare space into something cozy. I even splurged on a nice desk so I'd have a proper place to study. Every piece of furniture I brought in felt like a small act of reclaiming my life, one chair or bookshelf at a time. I framed my dad's letter and hung it above the desk as a reminder of why I was doing all this. His words were like a beacon, guiding me through everything. Enrolling in a 4-year program in college was the next big step. I had no idea how much I'd missed out on until I walked onto that campus for the first time. It was overwhelming but exciting, seeing all these students rushing to class, studying on the grass, and hanging out in the student union. For so long, I'd felt stuck, like my life was on pause while everyone else moved forward. But now, I was finally part of it. At first, I was terrified I'd be out of place. Most of the other students were younger than me, fresh out of high school, and I worried they'd see me as the weird older student. But no one seemed to care. In fact, a lot of them admired how determined I was. One of my professors even said, "It's never too late to bet on yourself," and that stuck with me. I threw myself into my classes, determined to make the most of this opportunity. The work wasn't easy, especially since I still worked part-time to cover my living expenses, without digging into the savings and inherited money. But I didn't mind. It's not an obligatory work anymore. I'm choosing this life for myself, and it's all coming back to me. Not Irene, not Clara. I was studying something I actually cared about, and every assignment, every lecture felt like another step toward the future my dad had envisioned for me. Meanwhile, Irene and Clara's lives were unraveling. They sold the family home to pay off debts, and from what I heard, they moved into a cramped apartment on the edge of town. Irene was working part-time at a discount store, and Clara was still folding sweaters at the mall. Every so often, they'd try to contact me, but their messages were never what you'd expect from someone who wanted to make amends. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments of what they'd done. Instead, it was always about money. "We're struggling, Emily. Can you help us out?" Or, "Family takes care of each other. You owe us that much." It was almost laughable. After everything they'd done, they had the nerve to act like I was the selfish one. I ignored every message, blocked their numbers, and moved on. They weren't reaching out to fix things. They just wanted another way to exploit me. The truth is, I didn't need their apology. I'd already made peace with the fact that they'd never change. Irene and Clara weren't capable of self-reflection or accountability, and waiting for them to suddenly become decent people would have been a waste of my energy. Cutting them out completely was the best decision I ever made. Now, when I think about them, it's like remembering characters from a story I used to know. Distant, irrelevant, and no longer part of my life. Their downfall wasn't my victory, because this was never about revenge. It was about freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of their control, their manipulation, or their entitlement. I was free to live my life on my own terms. And live it, I did. By the end of my first year at college, my grades were solid, and I'd landed an internship related to my major. The book club I created was thriving, and I'd even made a few close friends who felt like family. For so long, I'd been stuck in survival mode, but now I was finally building something. Something real, something lasting, something mine. I don't think about Irene and Clara much anymore. Occasionally, I hear updates through the grapevine, how they're barely scraping by, how their relationships with everyone else have fallen apart. But honestly, it doesn't matter to me. They no longer exist in my story. The life I'm living now isn't about them. It's about me. So that's where I'll leave this. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. Sharing this has been cathartic, but more than that, I hope it's a reminder to anyone who feels stuck in a toxic situation. You don't have to stay there. You don't have to let other people dictate your life or your worth. You're allowed to take control, even if it feels impossible at first. I've learned that freedom isn't just about cutting ties. It's about creating something new, something better. And as I sit here in my cozy little apartment, surrounded by books and plans for the future, I can finally say, this life is mine, and no one's ever taking it from me again.